So at one point in her life, Cheryl taught science. I don't know how she keeps coming up with these things. I think it has something to do with that. And I don't want to make it, but I'm sure someone out there will make a joke about science teachers being eggheads. Our gospel lesson this morning comes from the Gospel according to St. Luke, the 24th chapter, beginning at verse 1. Listen now for the word of the Lord as proclaimed by St. Luke the evangelist. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary mother of James, and the other women who were with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw linen clothes by themselves. And then he went home, amazed at what had happened. My sisters and my brothers, this is the word of the Lord.
When you read verse 11, these words seemed to them an idle tale. Those are words that ring so true for our experience. When people talk about resurrection and new life, we have a hard time at times in our lives believing, because we have experienced our own deaths and our own griefs, and it sounds like an idle tale, or as the New International Version says, nonsense. Nonsense. It just seems too good to be true. And that's why preachers feel a tremendous pressure at Easter to try to communicate this central message of hope that is the church's story. It's why preachers all over the world today are stressed out about communicating this truth. Some of them had a lack of sleep last night just because they were so stressed out about this. They remind me of the orchestra conductor who was having a big performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And he readied himself, he readied the orchestra. They'd worked for weeks on it, and it came the night for the big night of the performance. And when he arrived to conduct the service, he learned that his first chair violinist had been ill and was not going to be able to make the performance. He noticed over in the corner that the basses had popped a bottle of champagne and were celebrating. He went over to them and he said, what are y'all doing? You know, we've got a performance in just a few moments. He said, well, Joe here just got engaged. We're just having one to celebrate a little bit. But they seem to be celebrating a lot over there. And he was worried. And just before they were to take the stage, the second chair violinist also fell ill and was out. And so he began Beethoven's Ninth, and he's conducting, and everything's going well the first half of the performance. They get to the second half of the performance, and he notices that the basses begin to drag, and they're dragging along. Those basses who had celebrated so heartily before the performance, he's looking at them, and he's conducting the symphony, and he's getting frantic in his motions, trying to get them, come on, catch up. And they're dragging all the more. And the more they drag, the more frantically he begins to wave, so much so that he knocks his musical score to the ground. And he said, you talk about pressure. There I was, bottom of the ninth. 2 out. No score. And the bases were loaded. That's pressure. That's pressure. Do you know, I've realized through the years that the pressure I feel and every preacher feels, is really artificial, because the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a story that tells itself. It is the central truth of our Christian faith. It is the ground of our hope. And on that truth, we stand and we live and we die in that hope, knowing that death is not the end. Because we know the story of Jesus. It's the story of a God who loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son. Jesus, who came into the world announcing that God is love, in whom there is no darkness at all. God is light and love, and God is a God of forgiveness, of healing, of peace. A God who brings people together in joy and celebration. A God who welcomes home the lost and struggling child. A God in whom we find life in abundance. And that is why God sent Jesus into the world. And yet, that message of God's love was rejected by the evil forces that conspired against Jesus in this world. They conspired against him. He was arrested. He was tried. He was beaten. He was nailed to a cross. And there he suffered and died and was buried in a tomb. Now that's the part of the story we can truly identify with. And it's why this talk of resurrection for the disciples at first seemed like an idle tale, nonsense. Because they had seen their Lord crucified and then buried. And you and I can identify with that, can't we? Because we have seen dreams and hopes buried in tombs. We've seen relationships buried in tombs. We have seen loved ones buried in tombs. And we know the sting of death. We know the pain and the reality of the Good Friday world in which we live. And I've heard people say, you know, Easter is just a time for Christians to they couldn't deal with reality, so they had to create a happy ending to the story. And my objection to that is so strong, because of all people acquainted with grief and the reality of Good Friday, Christians, those of us who live this story of the death of Jesus, we know the reality of this story, that he lived and he died. Even the secular historians agree with that. And that's our reality too. We know that Good Friday is real. We know that there's suffering in this world. Sometimes just unexplainable suffering. People doing cruel things to one another. And people that even though we strive to be good people, we ourselves have injured one another. And we've seen the results of that, the reality of this Good Friday existence that we live. And so we know this story. I have a friend whose wife died within the last year, and I'd not seen him for a while, and we got together recently and we were talking, and he shared one of his fears, that his wife would be forgotten. And I so identified with him in that, and tried to assure him, but that's really our fear, isn't it? That this is all there is, and that when we die, that's it, and there is no more. And we have that fear, so we don't know what to do with that. It causes us all kinds of heartache in our lives. We don't know what to do with that. We think that it's all over. And yet there's this message of hope that the Bible gives to us, that we read the witness of the disciples, this decisive good news that he is not here, he is risen. You know, the women went to the tomb that first Easter morning, and they had seen the reality of Good Friday, but they went to the tomb to anoint his body and the stone had been rolled away and the tomb was empty, and then they encountered the living Lord. They encountered Jesus. The one who was crucified was now risen. And the disciples were slow to believe this. They seemed to think it was nonsense or an idle tale. But as they experienced the risen Christ themselves, they came to believe. They could no more explain the resurrection than we can. But their lives were explained by the resurrection. Because their lives took on a greater passion and meaning. These men and women who had been just a few days before cowards in the face of the threat of death would go on to live their lives in such a way that they would even be willing to be martyred for the cause of Christ. They believed so deeply. Would you do that for a hoax? Would you do that for something that was made up or a plot to steal the body and hide his body? Would you put your life on the line for something that wasn't true? These disciples lived their lives in such a way that they inspired others who found that life was filled with those Good Friday moments, found in the disciples' witness the Easter reality that was greater than the reality of the Good Friday reality, the reality that love cannot be killed. You can nail love to a tree, you can bury it in a tomb, but God will raise up love. That message of love will never die. And nothing can separate us from love. And our loved ones who have died are not forgotten, but are caught up in the love of God. And all of us live with that faith. We live with this hope. We stand on the ground of that hope, knowing that somehow, because of what God has done for us in Christ and his life, death, and resurrection, we have hope in our lives, and that even in the darkest moments of our lives, even when all hope seems lost, even when we feel like we've been buried in a tomb, that God has a resurrection for us. God has a future for us. We're not alone in this. God is a God of new life and new hope who will raise us up. And therefore, our task is to live the faith. We are called to put the faith into action. One of the best ways we can do that is to encourage others, to remind others when they are at the lowest moments of their lives that there is a ground of hope upon which we stand, a God of new life and new hope, a God of second chances, a God who opens up possibilities for our future, not just for us, but for all the world. God is at work in the midst of the darkness right now, and God has not given up on you, and God has not given up on this world. God is at work doing what God does. God is a God of resurrection. So I found this letter. My sister and I were informed about this letter from my cousin, a letter we never knew existed until just a few years ago. I've told this story before about my Uncle John, who was shot down in World War II and presumed dead. But this letter we'd never ever seen before. And it's a letter that my father wrote to his mother upon learning that his brother, his only brother, had been shot down and presumed dead. And it's dated June of 1944. My uncle was shot down June the 8th, 2 days after D-Day, over France. And I want you to listen to this, the words of a young man who had just turned 20 years old, who was in the Naval Chaplaincy School at Duke Divinity School, my father. My dearest mother, there's very little that I can say because you already know what is in my heart. Last night after your call, I thought and prayed a great deal of the night. And tonight I feel strengthened and am determined to carry on in the best possible way. I would say a few things which I know you have already thought of and are carrying out. Let us not give up hope. All is not lost. There are many chances that he is alive and well. I know that you will never believe, as I never shall, that he is gone until we have definite proof. Something deep inside of me tells me he is not gone. Let us keep faith with John as he would have us do. With that hope and faith, I love this. With that hope and faith, let us face the long days of uncertainty and anxiety that are ahead, doing our daily task and work, facing the future unafraid, knowing that no matter what the outcome, we can walk up to it and face it with the same courage, a song in our hearts, a smile on our faces, our trust in Christ, that John faced whatever came his way. Let us face this as he would have us do. There are many more things I would like to say to you which I cannot seem to say in a letter, but your heart will tell them to you. May faith, trust, and hope so fill your heart that you will become serene in spirit and be filled with the peace of God. To be filled with the peace of God in the face of overwhelming odds. I've shared before that my uncle was found, and 2 months later, out of the blue, he called his mother, and she promptly fainted. The last thing you expect when all you've dealt with is death and grief and darkness is that resurrection is real. And that's why we identify with the disciples when they say, they thought these things seemed to be an idle tale. But their witness tells a different story. That Jesus was raised from the dead, and he stands as the ground of our hope in which we stand, in which we move, in which we have our being. It is that ground of hope that causes us to live, not just wait until we die and celebrate everlasting life with God after we die. That's the promise and assurance of Easter, but the power of Easter is to live in that abundant hope this day and every day that God gives us as a gift. God is a God of resurrection, hope, and new life. Let us celebrate it.